Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's long been my contention that far more significant than anything that's ever come out of Washington, D.C., in helping this country move past the foolishness and wickedness of racism has been integration on the sports field. I say this because when I was a kid growing up, a rabid sports fan, it never once crossed my mind to include the color of a man's skin in how I felt about them as a player. I may not have been ready to judge people by the content of their character, but I was perfectly ready to judge them by the content of their batting average, or their earned run average, or their yards per carry. Now, I mention that because I started paying attention to football in 1972. This was the rookie season of Franco Harris, who was in the Hall of Fame, a running back that had come from Penn State. And his first year, the Steelers ever won a playoff game. 1973, the Steelers went to the playoffs again, but lost again prior to the Super Bowl. 1974 was the Steelers' first Super Bowl victory, first Super Bowl appearance, which was Super Bowl IX. But when the 74 season started, our starting quarterback was not Terry Bradshaw. Bradshaw had been with the team for 4 years or so, but he wasn't the starter. The starter was a young man by the name of Joe Gilliam. Jefferson Street Joe was his nickname, and he was the very first African American to start a season as a team's starting quarterback. And he is also today's hero you never heard of. Because I've got to tell you, as great as Terry Bradshaw ended up being, when I was a kid, I wanted to be Joe, not Joe Namath. I wanted to be Joe Gilliam. The man could sling the football. He was so bold, so athletic, so rifle-armed, and so smooth. It's just like, that's my guy. That's my hero. In fact, for years after, eventually he lost the job. He started the season with a record of 4-1-1 before losing the job back to Terry Bradshaw. And the reason for losing that job and losing his job completely, that is, falling off the roster a year or two later, was that Joe got involved in heavy drugs. And eventually Joe ended up living on the streets. It was a great fall for a great football hero. But by God's grace, he turned his life around. He got off of the drugs. He married a sweet and godly woman, got into coaching, and lived a respectable and honorable life at the end of his life. And that is probably more significant than what he did on the football field. But again, when I was a kid, this was our pattern. I mentioned my one of my heroes in an earlier segment was Randy Gooder. Randy was a year older than me. He was my next door neighbor. Now, we didn't have neighborhoods where we lived in Western Pennsylvania. We lived out in the country. But Randy was a year older than me, and it was our habit pretty much every Sunday in the fall to watch at our respective homes the Steeler game, and when the Steeler game was over, to venture outside and to toss the football. And we had this big field that we would play in, and at the end of the field there was a volleyball net, and we would give ourselves 4 downs to try to get the length of this field, which was certainly not 100 yards. And we had no defense either. One of us the quarterback, one of us the wide receiver. And then if we would score, we would kick the extra point over the field, over the volleyball net. By the way, we used an Itza ball. Those of you who are old enough to remember Itza balls, much, much superior to the Nerf ball. But we would take turns. One would be the quarterback, one would be the wide receiver. And we would not exclusively, but almost exclusively be the Steelers. And I would always want to be Joe Gilliam. For years later, after he was off the team, after he was gone, I wanted to be Joe Gilliam because of the way he played, the way he handled himself, the way he threw the ball. And by the way, when I was a receiver, I would always want to be Lynn Swann. Again, it wasn't because they were African Americans. Had nothing to do with it. It never crossed my mind. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no racism in my heart or in their lives. It just meant it got easily overcome when you're rooting for your favorite team. So, today, here in the midst of football season, another good season for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I remember this hero that you've never heard of, Joe Gilliam. I'd encourage you to look him up. Watch some highlights on YouTube. You'll see what I mean. I'm recording today not knowing what the situation will be politically in this country when this particular segment airs. But I'm comfortable doing that because whatever the political situation may be, we know this, that Jesus reigns. When I set out to reboot this particular podcast, the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, I didn't lose sight of how and why it came to have the name Jesus Changes Everything, because we want to affirm that reality, that Jesus' reign touches on all things. Just the other day, actually it was 2 nights ago, I had the opportunity to speak before and spend time with the young adults group at the church where Lisa and I are members. The leader of that group is my friend Justin Summers, one of the pastors at our church, a fine young man. And he invited me to come help him engage these young men and women in a conversation about politics and biblical principles for voting, because at the time that we had that meeting, the election was 5 days away. I have published segments on the podcast giving counsel on voting. I have written pieces for the blog dealing with voting. And yet I am committed to not becoming profoundly or essentially or principally political. Which brings us back to our title. One of the things that I said when I was talking with these young people was I gave them the quote, the famous quote, some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not, from the lips of Abraham Kuyper. Some of you may be familiar with him, some of you may not, but back in the early part of the 20th century, Abraham Kuyper founded the Free University of Amsterdam, which, by the way, is where my father did his doctoral work. Not with Kuyper, but with G.C. Berkhauer. But Kuyper not only founded the Free University of Amsterdam, he also founded and edited 2 newspapers in the Netherlands. And he not only did that, but he also for a time served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands. all while maintaining a deep and abiding commitment to sound Orthodox biblical Reformation theology. And he stands as this great example of someone who recognizes the lordship of Christ over all things. And that famous quote from him goes something like this. Kuyper is said to have said, "There is not one square inch in all of reality over which Jesus Christ does not declare mine." Jesus changes everything. Now, once again, you may come to this podcast and say, I like these segments, I'm not so interested in those segments, I'm not sure why in the world he thinks this is a good thing to do with this particular segment. I agree with him here, I disagree with him there. It's all well and good. But however disparate our subject matter may be, the ultimate truth is that our subject matter is Jesus and his reign over all things. What we're trying to do is help people not just understand the points that we're talking about, but to take the approach that we take to talking about these principles and apply them to everything, to help you see the reign of Jesus over all things. You understand that's what it means to seek the kingdom of God, is to make manifest, to make visible the invisible kingdom of God. And before we can make manifest and visible the invisible kingdom of God, we have to learn to see it first. Which is why we do what we do. And which is why we're seeking ministry partners. If you believe that there's not one square inch of all of reality over which Jesus Christ does not declare mine, if you believe that the lordship of Christ applies to how we vote in an election, and applies to what movies we look at, and applies to the books of the Bible, and applies to everything else that we talk about here on the podcast, would you consider partnering with us in this work that we're doing? Would you help us help others see more clearly the fullness and the scope of the reign of Jesus Christ? As always, the process is abundantly simple. All you need to do is log on to rcsprouljr.com, rcsprouljr.com. And right there on that homepage, there's a button that says donate. You click the button and it walks you through the whole process. If that won't work, you can mail us a check. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Well, I thank you again for listening through this particular weekly segment, and hope that you will continue to enjoy and be blessed by and informed by Jesus Changes Everything. Having spent some time and energy unpacking the meaning of the first commandment, the Westminster Divines, and giving us the shorter catechism at this point in our ongoing series, turn their attention to the second commandment. Question 49 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism asks simply, what is the second commandment? And answers this way. The second commandment is, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Now, as we know, moving forward, the Catechism is going to unpack their understanding of what this requires of us, what this forbids us to do, and a number of other issues that may come up in it. Today, what I'd like to do is simply and quickly highlight the distinction between the first and second commandments, because it's easy to see them as so closely related that they can be hard to tell apart. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic religion, when they come to the Ten Commandments, they divide them differently. And they consider this second commandment to actually be a part of the first commandment. And then they divide up the 10th commandment into 2 commandments, which is pretty brazen, as close as the first and the second are in our rendering. They're not anywhere near as close as the ninth and the 10th are in Rome's rendering. It's kind of scary. The whole motivation is to muddy up and obscure the fact that Rome does violate the second commandment with its use of imagery. So, what is the difference between the first and the second commandment? Well, I would put it this way. You could say that they're both about idolatry. But there's 2 things wrong with idolatry. 2 different kinds of ways that we use that word, idolatry. One of the meanings of idolatry is the worship of false gods. That when you bow down and give your homage to Vishnu, you have committed idolatry. If you worship, LeBron James, you have committed idolatry in this sense. But there's a second way in which we commit idolatry, and that is when we devote our worship to literal idols. Things that are made with human hands. The first commandment is God saying you had better not worship any other being. It's only me. Then he's saying in the second commandment, the way that you worship me must not be using as implements of your worship things made with human hands. It is a prohibition against worshiping the true God falsely. Whereas the first command is a prohibition against worshiping false gods at all. I hope that distinction makes things somewhat clear. It may help you to know that just like Rome, when Rome is backed up against the wall about their imagery, they will say things like this. We give service to these images. We don't actually worship them. We give them latria, but not duolatria, not hyper worship. We're just giving honor to these images. They're aids to us in worshiping the true and living God, whom we know is not contained inside our statues or inside our sanctuaries, but he is in heaven. That's what Rome is going to say. Well, the same is true of every being that bows down and worships in front of a stone image. We can mock them and say how ridiculous that you would cut down a tree and mold it and shape it and carve it, and then when you're finished, bow down and say, "You've made me." Well, of course it's ridiculous. So ridiculous that nobody actually does that. The person who makes their idol out of that wood or gold or stone or whatever it is, they know that's not the God who made them. But they think it represents the God who makes them. They think their service to it is rendered as service unto the God who made them. It's not the thing that they see, but it's the thing that they see through. And this is what God is forbidding here in the second commandment. We are not to worship him through images. So that when when I see pictures of Jesus or movies about Jesus, and I see Jesus up on the screen, I know that that's not really Jesus. I know that Jesus is in heaven. So even though I have all these experiences of worship, it's not really worship of the image, because I know the image is not. You're missing the point. The point is, you don't worship the true God through images. Now, he has given us bread and wine. He's given us the water of baptism. Which reminds me, by the way, this is one of the reasons why we know that this is not a prohibition against images at all. There are images in what God commanded to be done in the creation of the tabernacle and the creation of the temple. There's angels, there's pomegranates, there's all sorts of things of that nature, but they're not representations of God. So, there's still much to unpack. We'll look forward to looking more at what the Westminster Divines had to say about the second commandment. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.